What would you do if your own country suddenly broke up, and you were forced to choose a side? This is exactly the question millions of people faced in the American Civil War. A conflict that has decided not only politics and power, but also freedom, identity, and the fate of an entire nation. Before we dive deep into this story, you are asked, do you think this war could have been prevented, or was it inevitable? Be sure to write your opinion in the comments below. I'll read everything and I'm curious how you see it. If you are interested in such historical turning points and want to understand how decisions from then to now influence our world, then support the whole thing with a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss anything. And now let's go back to the beginning, to the moments when a nation has slowly but inexorably moved towards war. Chapter 1. A Nation Tears Apart. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States of America appeared to the outside world as an emerging united nation. A country full of opportunities, grown out of a revolution, supported by ideals such as freedom and self-determination. But behind this facade, a conflict was simmering that went deeper than political disagreements. It was a rift that slowly but inexorably ran through the entire country, a rift between North and South, between two completely different realities of life. In the North, an increasingly industrialized society developed. Cities grew, factories sprang up, railways connected regions with each other. Work here often meant wage labor. People sold their time and energy for payment. Progress was the watchword, and many believed that the nation had to move towards modernity. Education became more important, immigrants from Europe poured into the cities, and a new dynamic society emerged that was constantly changing. Life in the South was completely different. There, an agrarian economic structure dominated that was strongly based on large plantations. Cotton was the white gold that drove the economy, and its cultivation required enormous manpower. However, this labor was not paid, it was enslaved. Millions of African American men, women, and children lived in a system that took away all their freedom. For the plantation owners, this system was not only economically necessary, but also part of their social order and identity. Over decades, a fundamental contradiction has emerged. The North increasingly relied on free labor and economic diversity, while the South clung to a system based on slavery. This difference was not only economically, but also morally and politically charged. While more and more people in the North saw slavery as inhumane and outdated, many in the South defended it as a legitimate part of their lives and indispensable to their prosperity. But it wasn't just about economics or morality, it was also about power. Every new decision at the national level became a battle between these two worlds. Would a new state allow or prohibit slavery? Who would have the majority in Congress? Each of these questions had the potential to tip the balance. Compromises were made, laws were passed, but they were often only temporary solutions that further postponed the actual conflict. At the same time, mistrust grew. Many people in the South felt that the North wanted to impose their way of life on them. They saw themselves increasingly cornered, politically inferior, and culturally misunderstood. On the other hand, many in the North viewed the South as backward and morally wrong. The differences were no longer seen as diversity, but as irreconcilable opposites. The language also changed. Terms such as union and state rights became buzzwords behind which deeper convictions were hidden. For the South, state rights meant above all the freedom to make one's own decisions, especially with regard to slavery. For the North, on the other hand, the unity of the nation was in the foreground. These two points of view clashed more and more violently. In this tense atmosphere, individual events also played a decisive role. Books, speeches, and newspaper articles further fueled the mood, and stories about the suffering of the enslaved spread in the North and reinforced the rejection of slavery. At the same time, many people in the South felt attacked and misunderstood by such representations. The fronts hardened. It was as if two different countries existed under a common name. While the belief in progress and change dominated in the North, the South held on to traditions that it considered the basis of its society. Both sides were convinced that they were in the right, and both saw a threat in the other. Perhaps the most tragic thing was that this conflict did not only take place at the political level. He went through the middle of families, through friendships, through entire communities. People who had once shared the same values suddenly faced each other, not only in discussions, but soon also on battlefields. The closer you got to 1861, the clearer it became that tensions had reached a point where simple solutions were no longer sufficient. The compromises so far have acted like plasters on an ever-deepening wound. Every attempt to keep the balance only seemed to make the opposites more visible. Nevertheless, many hoped that it would not come to the worst. That reason could prevail and a way could be found to hold the nation together. But at the same time, the willingness to stand up for one's own convictions grew, even by force if necessary. Thus, the United States was at a turning point in its history. A nation that had once fought together for its independence was now fighting itself. The differences between North and South were no longer just political issues. They had become an existential question. What kind of country should America be? The answer to this question would not be found in debate or compromise. It would be decided on battlefields, in a war that would change everything. But before the first shots were fired, it was this slow, inevitable disintegration that paved the way. A process that showed how deeply divided a nation can be before it finally breaks up. Chapter 2: Slavery as a Core Conflict. If you want to understand the American Civil War, there is no way around one topic: slavery. It was not only a component of society, it was its foundation in the South and at the same time the biggest moral point of contention in the whole country. Everything else, every political decision, every compromise, every heated debate, ultimately revolved around this one question: is one person allowed to dispose of another person? For the Southern states, slavery was much more than just an economic system. It was deeply embedded in everyday life, culture, and self-image. Plantation owners saw themselves not only as entrepreneurs, but as part of an order that they saw as natural and necessary. Cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane brought in enormous profits, but these profits would not have been possible without the work of enslaved people. The entire economic structure of the South depended on this system. In the North, on the other hand, a completely different understanding of work and society developed. Although there was prejudice and discrimination there as well, the idea of owning people as property was increasingly rejected. Especially in the cities, a movement grew that not only criticized slavery, but actively fought it. These people, often referred to as abolitionists, saw slavery as a moral crime that could no longer be tolerated. One of the most influential voices of this movement was Frederick Douglass. As a former slave, he knew from his own experience what this system meant. In speeches and writings, he described the brutality and inhumanity of slavery so vividly that many people in the North really understood what was happening in the South for the first time. His words were not just criticism, they were accusations. Literary works also contributed to changing public opinion. The book Uncle Tom's Cabin in particular triggered a wave of indignation. It told the story of enslaved people from an emotional perspective and made the suffering tangible. For many readers it was a shock, for others a confirmation of what they already suspected. In the South, on the other hand, the book was condemned as propaganda, as a distorted portrayal of a supposedly functioning order. But while criticism of slavery grew louder in the North, the South reacted with growing resistance. Many felt attacked, not only in their economy, but also in their honor. They argued that outsiders did not understand their way of life. Some even went so far as to claim that slavery benefited enslaved people, a justification that is frightening from today's perspective, but was seriously defended by many at the time. The political stage increasingly became the scene of this conflict. Every new state that was admitted to the Union asked the same explosive question: should slavery be allowed there or not? These decisions had a direct impact on the balance of power in Congress. One more state on one side or the other could decide which laws were passed. In order to maintain this balance, compromises have been made again and again. One of the best known was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which drew a geographical line. Slavery was to be prohibited north of it and allowed to the south. But such solutions were only temporary. They postponed the problem instead of solving it. Over time, the conflicts became sharper. The so-called Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed the inhabitants of new territories to decide for themselves about slavery. What sounded like democracy led to violence in practice. In Kansas, bloody clashes broke out between supporters and opponents of slavery, a foretaste of what was to come. Another event that increased tensions was the verdict in Dred Scott versus Sandford. The Supreme Court ruled that African American people, whether enslaved or free, have no civil rights and therefore cannot sue in court. This decision shocked many in the North and was celebrated in the South as a confirmation of their position. It was a moment when it became clear how deep the division already was. But behind all these political and legal developments were real human fates. Slavery did not only mean forced labor, it meant the loss of freedom, family, and identity. People were sold, separated, punished. Their lives were controlled by others, without any possibility of defending themselves. And yet there was resistance. Enslaved people tried to flee, organized themselves secretly, or sabotaged the work on the plantations. They were supported by networks such as the so-called Underground Railroad, a secret system of escape routes and helpers that helped many to freedom. Every successful escape was an act of courage, and a sign that this system was not as stable as it seemed. With each passing year, it became clearer that slavery was not simply a political issue that could be resolved through compromise. It was a moral conflict that shook the foundation of the nation. For some it was indispensable, for others it was unacceptable. And the more both sides stuck to their convictions, the less likely a peaceful solution became. The discussions became more personal, more emotional, more unforgiving. Politicians lost control of developments, while the population took increasingly radical positions. Newspapers stoked fear, speakers fueled the mood, and more people were willing to fight for their convictions. In this situation, it became clear that the question of slavery was not just one of many, it was the decisive one. It determined how people thought about freedom, about equality, about the future of their country. And it represented a challenge that no one could escape. In the end, it was precisely this conflict that led the nation to the brink of the abyss. Not only economic interests, not only political power games, but the fundamental question of humanity and justice. A question that went so deep that it could no longer be answered by words. The United States was faced with a decision that would change everything. And as the fronts continued to harden, it became increasingly clear that this conflict would not end in assemblies. It would be resolved in a way that would shape the country forever. Chapter 3: Political Acid Test. In the years leading up to the American Civil War, the political situation in the United States reached a point where compromise was hardly possible. What once began as a dispute within a common system increasingly developed into an open acid test. Politics, which was supposed to create stability, itself became the scene of growing tensions, and ultimately an engine of escalation. At the center of this development was a man who was initially underestimated by many, Abraham Lincoln. When he was elected president in 1860, he was by no means the undisputed leader he is known as today. For many in the South, his election was rather a shock, a sign that they had lost political influence. Lincoln ran for the Republican Party, which was clearly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. It is important to note that at that time he did not call for the immediate abolition of slavery in the existing southern states. But the mere prospect that this system would not be allowed to grow further was perceived as an existential threat in the South. Because many knew that if slavery could not spread, it would lose importance in the long term. The election of 1860 made the division of the country clearer than ever before. Lincoln won without the support of a single Southern voter. This meant that a president had come to power who was not accepted by a large part of the country. For many in the South, this was final proof that their interests were no longer represented in the Union. But the political crisis did not begin with Lincoln. The party system had already changed in the years before. Old parties disintegrated, new ones emerged, and the political landscape became increasingly unstable. The Democratic Party, once one of the strongest forces in the country, split along regional lines. While Northern Democrats often tried to find compromises, their Southern counterparts took increasingly radical positions in favor of slavery. At the same time, the Republican Party gained influence, especially in the North. It united different groups: former Whigs, abolitionists, and people who were simply against the spread of slavery. This new political force called into question the previous balance and shifted the balance of power in the country. Another decisive factor was the increasing radicalization of the public debate. Politicians were under growing pressure from their voters to take clear positions. Compromises were no longer seen as a strength, but as a weakness. Those who gave and risked being labeled traitors. In this atmosphere, moderate voices became quieter and quieter. The tensions erupted not only in words, but also in deeds. A particularly dramatic example of this was Preston Brooks' attack on Charles Sumner in 1856. After Sumner gave a speech in which he sharply criticized slavery, he was brutally beaten with a stick by Brooks in the Senate. This event shocked the North and was partly celebrated in the South, a symbol of how deep the hostility already was. The situation also became increasingly difficult at the legislative level. Laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced escaped slaves to return, led to outrage in the North. Many people refused to obey this law and instead actively supported escaped slaves. This created a direct confrontation between federal laws and moral convictions. In the South, on the other hand, the fear grew that the North not only wanted to restrict slavery, but ultimately abolish it altogether. This fear was deliberately stoked by politicians. They warned of a loss of their own way of life, of economic ruin and social chaos. In their speeches, they painted a picture in which the Union no longer appeared as a protection, but as a threat. The idea of secession, i.e., the withdrawal of individual states from the Union, gained more and more supporters in this climate. For many in the South, this was not a radical step, but a logical consequence. They argued that the United States was originally founded as a voluntary association of sovereign states. If this merger no longer served their interests, they would have the right to leave it. In the North, on the other hand, this argumentation was firmly rejected. For many, the Union was indivisible, a common project that could not simply be abandoned. The idea that individual states could leave at will was seen as dangerous and destabilizing. There was hardly any room for understanding between these two positions. Every attempt to find a new compromise failed due to the growing intransigence of both sides. Even experienced politicians who had spent their lives trying to maintain the balance could no longer find a way to defuse the crisis. When Lincoln was finally elected in November 1860, the reaction in the South was swift and decisive. Even before he took office, several states began secession. South Carolina made the start, others followed. It was a dramatic step, one that made it clear that the political crisis had now entered a new phase. In this situation, Lincoln faced an enormous challenge. He had to lead a country that was already beginning to break apart before he was even officially president. At the same time, he tried to avoid war and preserve the Union. His words were cautious, his attitude determined. The Union should remain, but he was prepared to resolve conflicts as peacefully as possible. But the dynamics of events left little room for restraint. The decisions that were now made were no longer just political in nature. They had direct consequences for the entire country. Every action, every speech, every reaction could further escalate the situation. The political ordeal had reached its climax. A system that had once been designed to balance different interests had reached its limits. Trust had been lost, fronts had hardened, and the willingness to engage in dialogue had almost disappeared. What followed was not a sudden explosion, but the result of years of tension that had continued to build. Lincoln's election was not the beginning of the conflict. It was the moment when he became unmistakable. The United States was now faced with a decision that could no longer be made in parliaments or ballot boxes alone. The political stage had exhausted its possibilities. What came next would show whether a nation so deeply divided could still be held together at all, or whether it would finally break apart. Chapter 4. The Secession begins. After the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860, the political crisis could no longer be stopped. What had previously been a threat now became reality. The first Southern states began to break away from the Union. Secession was not a spontaneous act, but the result of years of tensions, fears, and convictions that had become more and more acute. For many people in the South, this step was not only justified, but necessary. The first was South Carolina in December 1860. In a specially convened assembly, the state officially declared its withdrawal from the United States. The reason was clear: they no longer see their own rights and interests protected. The question of slavery in particular played a central role in this. The political development in the North was perceived as a threat that was no longer acceptable. South Carolina, however, did not act in isolation. Within weeks, other states followed suit: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and finally Texas. These 7 states formed the core of what would soon become known as the Confederation. Each of these resignations increased the momentum. Each step made it more difficult to stop the process. In February 1861, representatives of these states met in Montgomery to form a new government. There the Confederate States of America was created, a separate state, with its own constitution, its own president, and the clear goal of preserving slavery as an integral part of society. Jefferson Davis, an experienced politician and former officer who was considered a staunch representative of the Southern states, was elected president. The new Confederate Constitution was similar in many respects to that of the United States, but there were key differences. Particularly striking was the explicit guarantee of slavery. While the original U.S. Constitution had deliberately left this issue open, it has now been clearly enshrined. This showed how central this question was for the Southern states. For the people in the South, secession was often associated with a feeling of new beginnings. Many believed that they were finally free to shape their own future, without interference from the North. There was a mixture of pride, determination, and also a certain euphoria. Parades were held, flags were hoisted, and the founding of the Confederation was celebrated. But not everyone shared this enthusiasm. There were also doubts and resistance in the South. Some people feared the economic consequences. Others doubted that a war could be avoided. Especially in regions where slavery was less widespread, support for secession was lower. Nevertheless, the proponents prevailed, often with great emphasis. In the North, on the other hand, secession was understood as a direct attack on the unity of the nation. Many could not accept that individual states could simply leave. The Union was considered indivisible, a project that could not be destroyed by individual interests. At the same time, however, there was also uncertainty. How should we react to this development? Was military intervention justified, or would it only exacerbate the situation? Abraham Lincoln himself was still in a difficult position at that time. Between his election in November 1860 and his assumption of office in March 1861, there was a phase in which he officially had no power, while the country was already disintegrating. His predecessor, James Buchanan, took a rather passive stance. He believed that secession was illegal, but did not believe that he had the authority to take military action against it. This uncertainty contributed to the movement in the South gaining further momentum. While the political situation became more and more tense, both sides began to prepare militarily. The Confederacy took over numerous military installations within its borders, including forts, arsenals, and other strategically important points. These takeovers usually took place without major violence, but they made it clear that the situation could escalate at any time. The situation became particularly critical for the remaining Union troops in the Southern states. They suddenly found themselves in an area that no longer saw itself as part of the United States. Their care became more difficult, their position increasingly insecure. One of the most important of these bases was Fort Sumter, a place that would soon play a decisive role. Secession was more than just a political act. It was a break with everything that had held the United States together until then. A country that had once united in the fight against external powers now faced the reality of facing itself. The common identity, which had grown over decades, began to disintegrate. It became increasingly clear that there was no easy way back. Each new state that left the Union made a return less likely. The establishment of its own government, the creation of its own institutions, all this created facts that could not be easily reversed. At the same time, the rhetoric intensified on both sides. In the South, independence was portrayed as a legitimate act of self-determination. In the North, on the other hand, it was described as a rebellion, an uprising against the lawful order. These different perspectives made it even more difficult to find common ground for negotiations. Nevertheless, many people hoped that it would not come to war. There were attempts to find new compromises, to organize mediation, to negotiate solutions. But the fronts were now so hardened that these efforts had little effect. Too much trust had been lost. Too many decisions had already been made. Secession had set in motion a dynamic that could no longer be stopped. What began as a political protest developed into a complete separation, with its own structures, its own goals, and a growing willingness to defend them with violence if necessary. In this tense situation, the nation was on the brink of war. The question was no longer whether there would be a conflict, but when and how it would begin. Events were coming thick and fast, tensions were at their peak, and the first sparks of open conflict were already visible. Secession was the moment when a crisis turned into a rupture, a break that could no longer be healed by words. And as both sides prepared for what was to come, it became clear that the next phase of this history would no longer be decided in parliaments, but on the battlefield. Chapter 5. The First Shot, Fort Sumter. When events came thick and fast in early 1861, the situation in the United States was already extremely tense. Several southern states had separated from the Union, formed their own government, and began to actively consolidate their independence. But despite these dramatic developments, one thing had not yet happened. There had not yet been an open war. Both sides faced each other, suspicious, vigilant, but still without the decisive step into violence. This moment was soon to change, in a place that would become a symbol of the beginning of the American Civil War, Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was strategically located in the port of Charleston, one of the most important cities in the southern states. The fortress was owned by the Union, although South Carolina had already declared independence. For the Confederacy, this was an untenable state of affairs. A United States military base in the middle of its territory posed a direct challenge to its authority. For the Union, on the other hand, Fort Sumter was a symbol of their presence, and a sign that they did not recognize secession. The situation in the fortress became increasingly critical. The soldiers stationed there under the command of Robert Anderson were isolated. Their supplies became scarce, and the possibilities for reinforcement were limited. At the same time, the Confederate troops reinforced their positions around the port. Cannons were set up, defenses were expanded. Everything indicated that an escalation was only a matter of time. When Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, he was immediately faced with one of the most difficult decisions of his presidency. Should he give up Fort Sumter and possibly avoid war? Or should he try to hold the fortress, at the risk of triggering a military confrontation? Lincoln chose a middle ground. He announced that he would send a supply ship to Fort Sumter, not with weapons, but with food. This decision was deliberately chosen. It was intended to show that the Union would not give up its position without actively starting the war. At the same time, she presented the Confederacy with a difficult choice. Would they let the ship pass, or would they see it as a provocation? For the Confederate leadership, especially Jefferson Davis, the situation was clear. A Union fort in the heart of its territory was unacceptable. The arrival of a supply ship would undermine their authority. Therefore, the decision was made to force the fortress to surrender, by force if necessary. On April 11, 1861, Robert Anderson was summoned to surrender Fort Sumter. Anderson refused. He was aware of the hopeless situation. but he acted according to his order, to hold the fort. This meant that the last attempt at a peaceful solution had failed. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, the first shot was finally fired. Confederate troops opened fire on Fort Sumter. Cannonballs broke the silence. Explosions shook the fortress. Smoke rose over the harbor. It was the moment when a political crisis turned into open war. The shelling lasted over 30 hours. The soldiers in the fortress were inferior, both in numbers and firepower. Nevertheless, they held out as long as they could. Conditions became increasingly difficult. Fire broke out, ammunition ran out, and the situation became increasingly dangerous. Despite the intensity of the attack, it is noteworthy that hardly any people died during the actual shelling. It was not until the capitulation that a tragic accident occurred, in which soldiers were killed. But regardless of the comparatively small number of victims, this event had enormous symbolic significance. It was the beginning of a war that was to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. On April 13th, Fort Sumter surrendered. Robert Anderson and his men were allowed to leave the fortress with honor. For the Confederacy, this was a first success, a sign of its determination and military capability. But at the same time, they had triggered something that went far beyond this one victory. News of the attack spread quickly throughout the country. In the North, it triggered a wave of indignation. Many who had previously hesitated now saw no other way than military resistance. The attack on Fort Sumter was perceived as a clear act of aggression, an attack on the Union itself. Abraham Lincoln reacted decisively. Shortly after the events, he called for the mobilization of 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union. This step made it clear that the conflict had now entered a new phase. It was no longer about negotiations or compromises. It was about war. But the attack also had far-reaching consequences in the South. Other states that had previously hesitated now joined the Confederation. The conflict spread. The fronts hardened further. What had begun as a regional dispute now turned into a full-scale civil war. Fort Sumter was more than just a military confrontation. It was a turning point, a moment in which all previous possibilities of a peaceful solution finally disappeared. The event showed that both sides were willing to fight for their convictions, and that they were no longer willing to give in. The symbolic power of this moment can hardly be overestimated. The first shot at Fort Sumter was not only the beginning of a war, but also the end of an illusion, the illusion that the United States could resolve its deep conflicts without violence. For the people in the country, this event changed everything. Men volunteered for the military, families were torn apart, entire regions prepared for a long and uncertain battle. The reality of the war suddenly came very close. At that time, no one was aware of how long and how brutal this war would become. Many believed in a quick victory, in a short confrontation that would soon be decided. But these expectations were to prove to be a tragic miscalculation. The attack on Fort Sumter was the first step in a conflict that would fundamentally change the United States. A war that decided not only territorial issues, but the future of an entire country. And as the smoke slowly cleared over Charleston, a new phase of history began, a phase in which words could no longer replace weapons, and in which the future of the nation would be decided on the battlefields. Chapter 6: Brothers versus Brothers. With the attack on Fort Sumter, the American Civil War had finally broken out. But what made this conflict so special and at the same time so tragic was not only its political or military dimension, it was the fact that it was a war within a country. No foreign enemy stood opposed. No clear border separated the sides. Instead, the front line often ran through the middle of families, friendships, and communities. It was a war in which brothers fought against brothers. For many people, the war did not begin on the battlefield, but in their own homes. Families had to make decisions that would change their lives forever. In the border states, where there was sympathy for both the North and the South, this situation was particularly dramatic. Here it could happen that two sons of the same family went different ways. One fought for the Union, the other for the Confederation. An impressive example of this is the state of Kentucky. Officially, Kentucky initially tried to remain neutral, but this neutrality was difficult to maintain because the population was divided. While some wanted to support the Union, others felt connected to the South. These tensions led to men from the same place, sometimes even from the same family, finding themselves on different sides. The situation was similar in Missouri, where there were even internal battles that took place independently of the major battles of the war. Guerrilla wars, raids, and local battles made it clear that this conflict was not only fought between armies, but also within society. The story of Robert E. Lee is particularly symbolic of this division. Lee was a respected officer in the U.S. Army and was considered one of the most capable military men of his time. When the war broke out, he was offered command of the Union troops. But Lee refused. Although he was personally opposed to secession, he chose to fight for his home state of Virginia, which had joined the Confederacy. His decision shows how strong loyalty to his own state could be, often stronger than loyalty to the nation. On the other side were people like George H. Thomas, also from Virginia, who deliberately chose the Union. This decision had personal consequences for him. His family turned away from him. His name was hardly mentioned in his homeland. Such stories were not isolated cases. They reflected the reality of a country that was internally torn. This division was also visible in the armies themselves. Many soldiers knew each other, had served together, or had met in peacetime. Now they faced each other on the battlefield. The idea of having to fight against former comrades was difficult for many to bear. But over time, the war became harder, and personal ties increasingly receded into the background. For the soldiers, the war meant not only physical strain, but also an enormous emotional challenge. Letters from that time show how torn many were. They wrote about their doubts, their fears, and their hope that the conflict would end soon. At the same time, they felt obliged to defend their side, whether out of conviction, a sense of duty, or loyalty to their community. The civilian population was not spared from this division either. In many places, the war led to mistrust and conflicts within the community. Neighbors watched each other, suspicions were raised, and loyalties were questioned. In some cases, violence has occurred, even far away from the major battlefields. Women play a particularly important role in this situation. They kept families together, cared for the wounded, and supported the war effort, often under difficult conditions. At the same time, they had to live with the uncertainty of whether their husbands, sons, or brothers would survive the war. For many, the conflict meant years of fear and loss. The division was also evident in the way people thought about the war. While some saw it as a necessary struggle for freedom or self-determination, others saw it as a senseless tragedy. These different perspectives meant that there was no uniform view of the events, even within families. As the war progressed, the fronts became harder and harder. What had initially started as a limited conflict developed into an all-out war that gripped more and more people. The initial hope for a quick solution gave way to the realization that this war would be long and costly. Nevertheless, the personal dimension of the conflict always remained present. Every fallen soldier was not just a number in a statistic, but a person with a family, with relationships, with a story. And often there were people on both sides who had more in common than divided. This tragedy made the American Civil War one of the most formative events in the history of the United States. It was not just a struggle over political or economic issues, but a conflict that deeply affected the social fabric of the country. The idea of brothers against brothers is more than just a symbolic image. It describes a reality in which the war was fought not only at the front, but also within society. A reality in which decisions had not only political consequences, but also personal ones. With every day that the war lasted, it became clearer how deep the wounds it left behind were. And even long after it ended, these wounds should still be felt. After all, a war that divides families and communities so much does not simply end with a capitulation. Its consequences reverberate for generations. Thus, Chapter 6 showed one of the most tragic sides of this conflict, that it was not just North versus South, but people against people who had once been part of the same nation. And it was precisely this closeness that made the war so relentless and so unforgettable. Chapter 7: Battlefields and Strategies. With the outbreak of the American Civil War, the conflict changed from political tensions and social antagonisms to a military conflict of unprecedented proportions on American soil. Both sides, the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South, were convinced that the war would be short. Many believed in a quick victory, in a decisive battle that could quickly end the conflict. But this hope was to prove to be deceptive. At the beginning of the war, neither the North nor the South were fully prepared for a long military conflict. Although both sides had experienced officers, the armies consisted largely of volunteers with no combat experience. Training, organization, and care were often inadequate. Nevertheless, the willingness to fight was great, on both sides supported by conviction, a sense of duty, and a strong belief in one's own cause. The first major battle of the war took place in July 1861, the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as Manassas. Many civilians from Washington even traveled to observe the battle, assuming that it was a short, almost spectacular event. But the reality was different. The battle developed chaotically, confusingly, and brutally. In the end, Union troops were forced to retreat, and the Confederacy won its first major victory. This outcome had far-reaching consequences. In the South, he strengthened self-confidence and the conviction that they were militarily up to the North. In the North, on the other hand, the defeat led to a shock, and to the realization that the war would be longer and harder than expected. Over time, both sides developed increasingly sophisticated strategies. The Union relied above all on its economic and industrial superiority. It had more factories, better infrastructure, and a larger population. These advantages should be decisive in the long term. A central strategy was the so-called Anaconda Plan, which aimed to weaken the Confederacy economically by blocking its ports while gaining control of the Mississippi River. The South, on the other hand, relied on defensive strategies. The aim was to defend their own territory and hold off the North for as long as possible. It was hoped that at some point the Union would no longer bear the costs and losses and would end the war. At the same time, the Confederation tried to win international support through military successes, especially from European powers. One of the most important military figures on the Confederate side was Robert E. Lee. He quickly became one of the most capable and respected generals of the war. Lee was known for his bold decisions, flexibility, and ability to achieve great success with limited resources. Under his leadership, the Confederacy succeeded several times in defeating numerically superior Union troops. On the Union side, the path to military leadership was initially more difficult. Several generals proved to be cautious or ineffective, causing frustration among the government and the population. It was only over time that leaders were found who were able to consistently use the strength of the North. A decisive turning point in strategic development was the realization that this war would not be decided by individual battles. Instead, it developed into a war of attrition, in which resources, organization, and perseverance played an increasingly important role. The nature of warfare also changed. New technologies such as improved rifles, railways, and telegraphs significantly influenced the course of the war. The range and accuracy of weapons increased, making battles more deadly. At the same time, railways enabled faster troop movements and more efficient supplies. But despite these technical advances, many military tactics initially remained outdated. Generals continued to rely on classic formations and frontal attacks, strategies that, in combination with the new weapons, led to high losses. It was only in the course of the war that tactics slowly adapted to the new conditions. The battlefields themselves became places of horror. What many soldiers had started as an adventure quickly developed into a reality full of suffering, fear, and death. Battles often lasted several days, marked by noise, chaos, and unimaginable violence. The wounded were often left without immediate medical care, and the hygienic conditions in the camps were poor. Another important element of warfare was morale. Both sides tried to motivate their soldiers and maintain the support of the population. Newspapers, speeches, and propaganda played an important role in this. Victories were celebrated. Defeats were often downplayed or explained. But the longer the war lasted, the more difficult it became to maintain the initial enthusiasm. The geographical extent of the conflict also posed a major challenge. The war was fought over a vast area, from the eastern coasts to the western territories. This made the coordination of the troops difficult and led to the fact that several fronts existed at the same time. With each new battle, it became clearer that this war was an enormous challenge not only militarily, but also strategically. Decisions had to be made under great pressure, often with incomplete information. Mistakes could have serious consequences, for individual units as well as for the entire course of the war. The first years of the war were marked by an alternation of successes and setbacks on both sides. Neither party was able to gain a decisive advantage. Instead, a grueling conflict developed, in which every battle, march, and decision became part of a larger whole. It became increasingly clear that the outcome of this war would not be decided on the battlefield alone. Economy, politics, technology, and popular support played just as important a role as military strength. The war became a complex interplay of many factors, in which strategy and perseverance were decisive. Chapter 7 thus shows an important insight. The American Civil War was not a simple conflict with clear lines and quick decisions. It was a modern war in which old and new elements collided, in which strategies developed and adapted, and in which each side tried to find its way to victory. But while generals made plans and armies moved, it was the soldiers who paid the price. On the battlefields, it became clear what this war really meant, and that its end was far from in sight. Chapter 8: The War Becomes Total. As the American Civil War went on, not only did the intensity of the fighting change, but so did the way that war was fought. What had originally begun as a military conflict between two armies gradually developed into a so-called total war, a war that was no longer fought only on the battlefields, but affected all areas of life: economy, society, infrastructure, and even the daily lives of the civilian population. At the beginning of the war, many still believed that the conflict would be limited to military objectives. Cities, farms, and civilian institutions were initially considered largely untouched. But the longer the war lasted and the clearer it became that neither side would win quickly, the more this idea changed. The boundaries between military and civilian goals began to blur. For the Union in the North, it was clear that in order to defeat the Confederacy, it was necessary to defeat not only its armies, but also its ability to continue the war. This meant destroying economic resources, cutting off supply lines, and weakening the morale of the population. This strategy aimed to exhaust the South not only militarily, but also economically and socially. The industrial strength of the North played a central role in this. While the South was heavily dependent on agriculture, the North had a well-developed industry. Factories produced weapons, uniforms, ammunition, and other essential goods in large quantities. Railways quickly transported troops and supplies to the front, and the use of the telegraph enabled more efficient communication. The South, on the other hand, faced major challenges. Its economy was less diversified, and its dependence on cotton as its main export increasingly proved to be a weakness. The blockade of the southern ports by the Union, part of the so-called Anaconda Strategy, largely cut off the Confederation from international trade. This led to shortages of important goods and significantly weakened the economic basis of the South. Over time, the war became more and more noticeable for the civilian population. In the South, the blockade and the destruction of infrastructure led to supply problems. Food became scarce, prices rose, and many families suffered from the consequences of the war. Cities that previously seemed far away from the action were now directly affected. A particularly formative example of this development is the approach of William Tecumseh Sherman. His military strategy went beyond classical battles. In 1864, he carried out his famous March to the Sea, in which his troops marched from Atlanta to the coast of Georgia. In the process, they deliberately destroyed infrastructure, railways, warehouses, and other economically important facilities. The aim was to weaken the South's ability to continue the war in the long term. Sherman's actions were controversial, but it clearly showed how warfare had changed. The war was no longer waged only against soldiers, but also against the economic and social structures of the enemy. This strategy had a profound impact, not only on the course of the war, but also on the people living in the affected areas. The war also had far-reaching consequences in the North. The mobilization of millions of soldiers changed society. Many men left their families and jobs to fight. Women took on new roles, worked in factories, organized relief efforts, or supported the supply of the troops. The war led to a change that had a lasting impact on social structures. At the same time, the role of the state has become stronger. Governments increasingly intervened in the economy to coordinate the war effort. Taxes were raised, new laws were passed, and production was geared to military needs. This development was a further step towards an all-out war in which all resources were mobilized. Another important aspect was the psychological dimension of the conflict. Both sides tried to maintain the morale of their population and weaken that of the enemy. Newspapers reported victories, propaganda was used, and public opinion played an increasingly important role. But the longer the war lasted, the more difficult it became to maintain the initial support. In the South, the increasing burden led to growing dissatisfaction. The supply situation deteriorated, and many people began to question the leadership of the Confederacy. Desertions increased, and support for the war crumbled. In the North, on the other hand, industrial strength remained a decisive advantage, but war fatigue grew there as well. A particularly tragic aspect of all-out war was the increasing destruction of livelihoods. Fields were devastated, houses destroyed, cities plundered. For many people, this meant the loss of everything they owned. The war left not only physical damage, but also deep emotional wounds. At the same time, the role of slavery in this context became increasingly clear. The economic weakening of the South also affected the slavery system itself. More and more enslaved people took advantage of the turmoil of the war to flee or join the Union troops. The war began to directly undermine the foundations of this system. Over time, it became clear that this conflict was no longer just a struggle for political power. It was about the basic structure of society, about economic systems, about freedom and control. Total war changed not only the course of the conflict, but also the way people perceived war. The boundaries between the front and the homeland became increasingly blurred. No one was really uninvolved anymore. Everyone was affected in one way or another, whether as a soldier, as a worker, as a family member, or as a civilian in a contested area. Chapter 8 thus shows a decisive development in the course of the war, the expansion of the conflict to all areas of life. The American Civil War became a war that pitted not only armies but entire societies against each other. And as the fighting continued and the strain on both sides mounted, it became increasingly clear that this war would not be decided by military victories alone. It was a struggle for perseverance, resources, and the ability to continue despite all the losses. The war had reached a new dimension, one in which there was no turning back. Chapter 9: The Role of Slaves and African Americans. In the course of the American Civil War, not only the military and political situation changed, but also the role of those around whom the conflict revolved at its core, the enslaved and free African American population. What was treated as a marginal aspect at the beginning of the war increasingly developed into a central element, both on a strategic and moral level. African Americans went from being passive victims to being active actors in a conflict that was to determine their future decisively. At the beginning of the war, the official stance of the Union was still cautious. President Abraham Lincoln first emphasized that it was primarily about preserving the Union, not abolishing slavery. This attitude was politically motivated, as it did not want to jeopardize the loyalty of the border states where slavery still existed but which did not belong to the Confederacy. But while the political leadership hesitated, many enslaved people were already acting themselves. With the advance of the Union armies, They were presented with an opportunity that they took advantage of, to flee. Thousands of men, women, and children left plantations and sought protection from the troops of the North. For them, the war was not just a political conflict, it was a chance for freedom. An early turning point in this context was Benjamin Butler's decision not to return escaped slaves, but to treat them as countergangs of war. This classification was a legal trick, but it had great practical implications. It allowed the Union to keep escaped slaves and use them for its own purposes without officially abolishing slavery. Thousands of refugees soon lived in the so-called contraband camps. Conditions there were often difficult, but they offered something that was previously unattainable, the prospect of a life in freedom. Many of these people worked for the army, as workers, cooks, nurses, or in other support roles. In doing so, they contributed directly to the Union's war success. As time went on, it became increasingly clear that African Americans could play an important role not only as workers, but also as soldiers. Initially, the idea of arming black men was controversial. Many in the North had reservations, and there was also resistance within the army. But the reality of the war changed this attitude. A decisive step was the official permission to form African American regiments. One of the best known was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. This regiment consisted of African American soldiers and was led by white officers. His use in battle, especially at the Battle of Fort Wagner, became a symbol of courage and determination. The soldiers of this regiment and many others proved that they were ready to fight for their freedom and for the Union. They saw military service not only as a duty, but also as an opportunity to demand their equal rights. In total, around 180,000 African American men served in the Union's armed forces, a significant contribution that influenced the course of the war. But their use was associated with great challenges. African American soldiers were often paid less, poorly equipped, and had to stand up to prejudice. In addition, if they were captured by the Confederacy, they ran the risk of being punished not as prisoners of war, but as escaped slaves. Despite these risks, they fought with great determination. In addition to military action, African Americans also played an important role as informants and supporters. They provided vital information about Confederate troop movements, helped navigate uncharted terrain, and aided escape routes for other enslaved people. Their knowledge and experience have been invaluable to the Union. Women also contributed to the course of the war in many ways. They worked as nurses, organized aid networks, or supported their families under the most difficult conditions. Some were actively involved in the resistance or helped others escape. Their contributions are often less well known, but they have been crucial to the functioning of many structures in the background. As the war continued, the question of slavery became more and more central to the Union's goals. The pressure of abolitionists, the reality on the battlefields, and the growing number of escaped slaves led to a rethink. Finally, Abraham Lincoln also realized that the war could not be won without directly attacking the system of slavery. This development led to one of the most important decisions of the war, the Emancipation Proclamation, which came into force at the beginning of 1863. It declared the slaves in the rebellious states free and thus fundamentally changed the character of the war. From then on, it was no longer just about the unity of the nation, but also about the abolition of slavery. For the African American population, this was a historic moment. Even if the proclamation did not immediately liberate all people, it was a decisive step towards freedom. It gave new meaning to the struggle and strengthened the motivation of many to actively participate. The role of African Americans in the Civil War shows that they were not only victims of a system, but also shapers of their own history. They took advantage of the opportunities that were available to them, fought for their rights, and contributed significantly to the outcome of the conflict. Chapter 9 makes it clear that the American Civil War was not only a conflict between North and South, but also a struggle for freedom and equality. The participation of African American people added an extra dimension to this war, one that continues to have an impact today. In the end, their contribution was not only militarily decisive, but also symbolic. He showed that the desire for freedom can be stronger than any oppression, and that even in the darkest times of history, people can find the courage to fight for a better future. Chapter 10: The Emancipation Proclamation. In the course of the American Civil War, the conflict reached a point where a decision could no longer be postponed: the question of slavery. What had been treated cautiously at the beginning of the war now increasingly moved into the center of political and moral debate. The events on the battlefields, the growing number of escaped slaves, and the increasing pressure from the population finally led to a step that was to fundamentally change the war: the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. When Abraham Lincoln took office, his top priority was to preserve the Union. He knew that a too early or too radical stance on slavery could drive the border states that were still part of the Union but practiced slavery to Confederacy. Therefore, he initially pursued a cautious strategy. But over time, it became clear that this approach would not be enough. The war developed differently than expected. Instead of a quick victory, it became a protracted and costly conflict. At the same time, more and more enslaved people took the opportunity to flee to the lines of the Union. Their presence posed new questions to the government. Should they be returned? Should they be released? And what role should they play in the war? At the same time, pressure from abolitionists, who had long been calling for an end to slavery, grew. They saw the war as an opportunity not only to save the Union, but also to end a fundamental injustice. For them, it was clear that a war waged without attacking slavery missed its moral goal. Lincoln began to take these arguments seriously, but he also knew that a decision had to be well prepared. A hasty declaration could have had political consequences that would have jeopardized the outcome of the war. So he waited for the right moment, a moment that was not only politically sensible, but also militarily viable. This moment came in September 1862, after the Battle of Antietam. Although this battle was not clearly decided militarily, the Union was able to present it as a strategic success. This gave Lincoln the opportunity to take an important step without giving the impression of weakness. Shortly afterwards, he announced the Emancipation Proclamation, which came into force on January 1, 1863. She explained that all enslaved people in the rebellious states were free from that point on. It is important to understand that this proclamation did not immediately free all slaves. It applied only to territories outside the control of the Union. In the border states and already conquered territories, slavery initially remained. Despite these restrictions, the proclamation had enormous significance. It fundamentally changed the character of the war. From then on, it was no longer just about the unity of the nation, but also about the abolition of slavery. The war became a moral struggle that decided the future of society. For the African American population, the proclamation was a glimmer of hope. It was an official signal that their freedom was not just an individual goal, but a political concern. Many saw this as confirmation that their struggle was part of a larger whole. At the same time, the proclamation also had strategic implications. It enabled the Union to officially accept African American soldiers into the Army. This greatly increased the military strength of the North and helped to influence the course of the war. The decision also had major consequences internationally. European powers such as Britain and France had previously considered recognizing or supporting the Confederation. But with the Emancipation Proclamation, the war became a fight against slavery. Supporting the Confederation would have meant siding with a system that was increasingly rejected in Europe. This significantly reduced the likelihood of international intervention in favor of the South. In the South, on the other hand, the proclamation was perceived as a provocation. Many saw it as a direct attack on their way of life and their economic basis. At the same time, it increased the fear of uprisings by enslaved people, which led to even harsher measures and further escalation. But the proclamation was more than just a political document. It was a symbol, an expression of a fundamental change in the attitude of the Union. It showed that war was not only fought to preserve a country, but also to change it. For Lincoln himself, this decision was not easy. He was aware of the risks, the political tensions, and the possible consequences. But he also recognized that this step was necessary, not only for strategic reasons, but also out of moral conviction. Over time, it became clear that the Emancipation Proclamation was a decisive turning point. It strengthened the Union's position, weakened the Confederacy, and gave the war a new meaning. It was a step on the way to the final abolition of slavery, which was finally completed with the 13th Amendment. Chapter 10 makes it clear that the American Civil War was shaped not only by military decisions, but also by political and moral turning points. The Emancipation Proclamation was one of those moments, a moment when the direction of the war changed and the future of the country was redefined. It was not the end of the struggle, but a new beginning. A beginning that showed that even in the midst of a brutal war, decisions can be made that go far beyond the immediate conflict. And as the fighting continued, it became increasingly clear that this war would not only determine whether the Union would survive, but also what freedom really meant in this country. Chapter 11, Gettysburg, the Turning Point. In the summer of the American Civil War, the conflict reached a phase in which it became increasingly apparent that a decision was approaching. Both sides had suffered heavy losses, but neither has been able to achieve the decisive breakthrough so far. In this situation, the Confederacy dared to take a step that would significantly influence the course of the war, an offensive on the territory of the North. This advance led to one of the most significant battles of the entire war, the Battle of Gettysburg. The plan came from Robert E. Lee, who, after several successes in the East, was convinced that an attack on the territory of the Union could bring several advantages. On the one hand, he hoped to keep the fighting out of the South and thus relieve his own regions. On the other hand, a victory on Northern soil should shake the morale of the Union and possibly weaken political support for the war. In addition, there was hope that such a success could bring international recognition to the Confederation. In June 1863, Lee's army crossed the border into Pennsylvania. The troops moved quickly and looked for a suitable place for a decisive confrontation. This place would eventually become the small town of Gettysburg, a seemingly insignificant place, but one that became a strategic hub due to its location. Several roads converged here, making it an ideal venue for a major battle. The encounter between the two armies began rather by chance. On July 1, 1863, the first units met, and what began as a small skirmish quickly developed into a full-scale battle. The Confederate troops initially had the upper hand on this first day and were able to push the Union soldiers back through the city. But the Union did not withdraw completely, but regrouped on the heights south of Gettysburg. This position was to prove decisive. The ridges on which the Union Army had entrenched itself offered a strategic advantage. From there, they were able to survey the terrain and organize their defenses. The lines of the Union formed a kind of hook shape, a structure that proved stable and difficult to break. On the second day of the battle, the Confederacy tried to break through this position. Fierce fighting erupted at various points, including locations like Little Round Top and Devil's Denver. Especially at Little Round Top, there was fierce fighting. The defense of this hill was crucial, since its loss would have endangered the entire line of the Union. With great commitment, the Union soldiers managed to hold the line. The intensity of the fighting increased steadily. Artillery fire, infantry attacks, and hand-to-hand combat dominated the action. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but neither was able to gain a clear advantage. The battle developed into a grueling struggle in which every decision, every movement decided on life and death. On the third day, Robert E. Lee made a momentous decision. He was convinced that the center of the Union line was weakened and decided to launch a direct attack. This attack, known as Pickett's Charge, was to become one of the most famous and tragic moments of the battle. Thousands of Confederate soldiers advanced across open terrain onto the fortified lines of the Union. They had to cover a great distance while being under constant artillery and rifle fire. The attack was risky from the start, and quickly developed into a disaster. The losses were enormous, and only a few soldiers even reached the enemy lines. The attack failed. The Confederate troops had to retreat, and Lee's offensive had finally failed. On July 4th, the withdrawal of the Confederacy from Pennsylvania began. The Battle of Gettysburg was over. The losses on both sides were devastating. In total, more than 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, a number that made the battle the bloodiest of the entire war. Entire units were wiped out, families lost several relatives, and the landscape around Gettysburg was marked by the traces of the fighting. But beyond the immediate losses, the battle had enormous strategic importance. It marked the culmination of the Confederacy offensive in the North. After Gettysburg, Lee was no longer able to take a similar initiative. The Confederation increasingly went on the defensive. For the Union, the victory was an important moral and strategic success. It showed that the Confederate Army could be defeated and strengthened confidence in the further course of the war. At the same time, it was a moment that strengthened the determination of the population to continue the struggle. A few months after the battle, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech that became known as the Gettysburg Address. In a few words, he managed to describe the significance of the events in a way that continues to have an impact today. He spoke of the fallen, of their sacrifice, and of the task of the living to continue the work for which they had fought. This speech made it clear that Gettysburg was not only a military turning point, but also a symbolic one. It gave war a deeper meaning and linked it to the fundamental ideals of the nation. Chapter 11 thus shows how a single battle can change the course of an entire war. Gettysburg was not the end of the conflict, but it was a moment when the direction became clearer. The initiative increasingly went over to the side of the Union, while the Confederation lost strength. At the same time, the battle remains an example of the brutality and tragedy of war. It shows how high the price of such turning points can be, and how closely success and loss are linked. As the smoke settled over the fields of Gettysburg, one thing was clear: the war was far from over. But the events of those 3 days had shown that the balance had shifted, and that the outcome of the conflict was now moving in a new direction. Chapter 12: Life in War. The American Civil War was decided not only on the major battlefields, but also in the everyday lives of millions of people who lived far away from the direct fighting, or were trapped in the middle of it. While generals developed strategies and armies clashed, an equally significant part of the war took place in the daily lives of soldiers, women, children, and civilians. It was a life of deprivation, uncertainty, and constant change. For the soldiers, the war often began with a mixture of a thirst for adventure and a sense of duty. Many volunteered, convinced that the conflict would be resolved quickly. But these expectations were quickly overtaken by reality. Everyday life in the military consisted not only of battles, but above all of waiting, marching, and surviving under difficult conditions. The camps in which the soldiers lived were often poorly equipped. Tents offered little protection from the weather, hygiene was a constant problem, and diseases spread quickly. In fact, more soldiers died of disease than in combat. Infections, lack of medical care, and poor nutrition made life in the camp a constant burden. When it came to fighting, the conditions were even more brutal. The wounded often had to wait for hours for help, and medical procedures were carried out in primitive conditions. Doctors worked with limited resources, often without sufficient knowledge of infectious diseases or hygiene. Amputations were often the only way to save lives. Between the battles, many soldiers tried to maintain a bit of normality. They wrote letters to their families, told them about their everyday lives, their hopes and fears. Today, these letters are valuable testimonies that show how much the war put an emotional strain on people. Many wrote of homesickness, of doubt, and of the longing for an end to the conflict. For the families at home, life was also shaped by the war. Women took on tasks that had previously been reserved for men. They ran farms, worked in shops, or were involved in caring for the wounded. The war changed their role in society and forced them to take on new responsibilities. The effects of the war were particularly felt in the South. The blockade of the ports led to supply bottlenecks, food became scarce, and prices rose sharply. Many families had to make do with little and improvise in order to survive. Clothes were mended, food stretched, and every day brought new challenges. Children grew up in a world that was characterized by uncertainty. Many lost fathers or brothers, had to take responsibility early on or witness how their homeland was destroyed. The war left traces that went far beyond the immediate events. In the cities, the war manifested itself in a different way. Hospitals were overcrowded, wounded people were returning from the fronts, and society had to learn to deal with the consequences of the war. At the same time, cities became important centers for production and organization, especially in the North, where industry played a central role. Another important aspect of life in war was constant uncertainty. No one knew how long the conflict would last or how it would end. News often spread slowly or was unreliable, leading to rumors and fear. Every battle could change the lives of thousands of people, and every piece of news could bring hope or despair. The emotional burdens were also enormous. The loss of loved ones, the constant fear of bad news, and the general uncertainty led to deep exhaustion. Many people tried to find support in faith, in community, or in the hope of an early end. For the African American population, the war had a special significance. For many, it was not just a conflict between North and South, but a struggle for freedom. While some continued to live in difficult conditions, others took advantage of the changes to find new opportunities and actively shape their future. The war also brought new forms of communication and organization. Newspapers regularly reported on the events, and people followed the course of the war with great interest. At the same time, aid organizations were founded to care for the wounded and needy. But despite all the adjustments, life during the war remained marked by loss. Every family, every community was affected in one way or another. The war was no longer just a distant event, it had become part of daily life. Chapter 12 shows that the American Civil War was marked not only by great battles and political decisions, but also by the experiences of the people who lived through it. It was a war that intervened in the lives of each individual and changed them permanently. And as the fighting continued and the strain mounted, it became increasingly clear that the true price of this conflict could be measured not only in numbers, but in the stories of the people who lived through it. Chapter 13: The Long Road to Victory. After the events of Gettysburg and the increasing successes of the Union, the balance of power in the American Civil War began to shift slowly but significantly. But although a strategic advantage for the North was emerging, the war was far from decided. Instead of a quick end, a phase began that was characterized by perseverance, exhaustion, and increasingly harder fights. A long road on which victory was not to be achieved by a single decisive blow, but by continuous pressure. The Union had advantages in many ways: a larger population, stronger industry, better infrastructure, and more resources. But these advantages alone did not guarantee victory. They had to be used strategically, and this was exactly where the challenge lay. In the first years of the war, the North had often hesitated to use its superiority consistently. But over time, this approach changed. A central figure in this phase was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant distinguished himself from many of his predecessors in his determination and willingness to take risks. He recognized that the Union's strength lay not only in individual victories, but in its ability to keep up the pressure continuously. His goal was not only to defeat the Confederate armies, but to exhaust them permanently. Grant pursued a strategy of simultaneous action. Instead of looking at individual battlefields in isolation, he coordinated several offensives at the same time. This forced the Confederacy to distribute its forces and made it more difficult to respond effectively to individual attacks. The war became a full-scale struggle in which every region, every movement was part of a larger plan. Especially in the East, there were a number of intense battles between Grant's troops and the army of Robert E. Lee. These clashes, known as the Overland Campaign, were marked by brutal fighting and heavy casualties on both sides. Places like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor became symbols of the harshness of this phase of the war. Unlike previous generals, Grant did not retire after heavy losses. Instead, he continued to advance, again and again, step by step. This strategy put enormous pressure on the Confederacy. While Lee was forced to defend and conserve his forces, Grant was able to use his numerical superiority to continue the fight. At the same time, the Union continued to suspend its control over the West. The capture of strategically important areas, especially along the Mississippi River, cut the Confederacy in two and made it much more difficult to coordinate its troops. These developments weakened the South not only militarily, but also economically. Another decisive factor was the increasing exhaustion of the Confederacy. Resources became scarcer, supplies more difficult, and morale began to decline. Desertions increased, and many soldiers were physically and mentally at the end of their rope. At the same time, the civilian population suffered from the consequences of the war, which further weakened support for the conflict. In the North, on the other hand, industrial production remained high. Factories worked tirelessly to supply the army, and infrastructure allowed for rapid troop movements. Despite growing war fatigue, support for the war largely remained, also because it became increasingly clear that an end could be in sight. The Union strategy was increasingly aimed not only at defeating the Confederacy militarily, but also at completely breaking its ability to resist. This meant that the war became more and more intense and comprehensive. Infrastructure was destroyed, supply lines were interrupted, and the economic base of the South was further weakened. But this path was not without costs. The losses on the part of the Union were high, and many people began to question the strategy. Was it justified to sacrifice so many lives to win the war? These questions were discussed in public and posed major challenges for the political leadership. Despite these doubts, Abraham Lincoln remained determined. He supported Grant's strategy and recognized that a consistent approach was necessary to end the war. His leadership played an important role in maintaining the direction of the war and securing popular support. Over time, it became clear that the Confederacy could not withstand the increasing pressure for much longer. The losses, exhaustion, and economic difficulties had left their mark. Each subsequent month of the war worsened their situation. Chapter 13 shows that the path to victory was not determined by a single moment, but by a series of decisions, strategies, and developments that spanned an extended period of time. It was a process that required patience, perseverance, and determination, and one that was fought both on the battlefield and in society. The American Civil War was coming to an end, but it was marked by sacrifices and challenges. The victory of the Union was not only the result of military strength, but also the result of a strategy aimed at weakening and ultimately overcoming the opponent in the long term. And as the final chapters of this conflict were written, it became increasingly clear that this victory meant not only the end of a war, but also the beginning of a new phase in the history of the United States. Chapter 14: The End of the Confederacy. After years of fierce fighting, countless casualties, and growing exhaustion, the American Civil War was nearing its end. The developments of the last few months had made it clear that the Confederation had increasingly reached its limits. Their resources were exhausted, their armies weakened, and the hope of victory was diminishing by the day. Nevertheless, the end was not a sudden moment, but a slow, inevitable collapse. In 1864 and at the beginning of 1865, the Union had consistently implemented its strategy. The pressure on all fronts increased, and the Confederate troops were forced to retreat further and further. The situation escalated dramatically, especially in the East. Robert E. Lee's army, once one of the strongest military forces, was severely decimated by the ongoing fighting. One of the decisive phases was the siege of Petersburg. This city was of strategic importance as it was an important transportation hub and utility point for the Confederate capital of Richmond. Union troops under Ulysses S. Grant surrounded the city and gradually cut off supply lines. The siege dragged on for months and became a grueling battle that further weakened the forces of the Confederacy. During this time, the situation in the South deteriorated increasingly. Food was scarce, inflation was rising, and the civilian population was suffering from the consequences of the war. Many people lost faith in a possible victory. Desertions increased, and even within the army the situation became more and more difficult. Soldiers were exhausted, poorly cared for and increasingly demoralized. In April 1865, the decision was finally made. The lines of the Confederation broke, and Petersburg had to be abandoned. Shortly afterwards, Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was also evacuated. For many, this was the moment when it became clear that the end was near. The Confederate government fled, and the last remaining troops tried to regroup. But the situation was hopeless. Robert E. Lee was still trying to lead his army west, hoping to unite with other units and continue the fight. But the Union troops were faster. They cut off the retreat and finally forced Lee to make a decision. On April 9, 1865, the capitulation took place at Appomattox Courthouse. Lee met with Ulysses S. Grant to discuss the terms. This meeting became a symbolic moment, not only for the end of the fighting, but also for the way this war was to be ended. Grant was generous in the conditions. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home, keep their horses, and not be treated as traitors. This decision was made deliberately to enable reconciliation and to facilitate the transition to a new phase. With the surrender of Lee, the war was effectively decided, even if smaller battles were still taking place in other regions. Gradually, the remaining Confederate troops also laid down their arms. The Confederation, which had once been founded with great hopes, no longer existed. But the end of the fighting did not mean the end of the challenges. The country was deeply divided, the wounds of the war were fresh, and the question of how to proceed was in the air. Millions of people had to reorganize their lives. Soldiers returned home, families tried to come to terms with losses, and entire regions were on the verge of reconstruction. The effects of the war were particularly visible in the South. Cities and infrastructure were destroyed, the economy was in tatters, and the social fabric was shaken. The abolition of slavery presented society with fundamental changes that could not be implemented overnight. The war had also left its mark in the North. Although the Union had won, the losses were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people had lost their lives, and the memories of the war would continue to have an impact for a long time. Another tragic moment followed just a few days after the capitulation. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. His death shook the country and deprived him of a leader who had played a decisive role in the course of the war. Lincoln had advocated a conciliatory policy, and many wondered how the country would develop without him. Chapter 14 shows that the end of the Confederacy was not just a military victory, but a complex transition to a new phase of history. It was the end of a conflict, but also the beginning of a long process of healing and rebuilding. The American Civil War had fundamentally changed the country. He had redefined the unity of the nation, ended slavery, and strengthened the role of the state. But he had also left deep traces that did not simply disappear. The end of the Confederation was therefore not only a conclusion, but also a beginning. A beginning that showed that even after such a destructive conflict, there is an opportunity to find a new path, even if this path is marked by challenges and uncertainties. And while the guns fell silent and the soldiers returned home, a new task began for the United States: to create a common future out of the rubble of war. Chapter 15: A New America Emerges. With the end of the American Civil War, the conflict was decided militarily, but the real challenge only began now. 4 years of war had profoundly changed the country, politically, economically, and socially. The United States was faced with the daunting task of redefining itself. It was no longer just a matter of maintaining a union, but of building a common future in which the causes of conflict could be overcome. One of the most significant results of the war was the final abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment ended a system that had oppressed millions of people for generations. For the formerly enslaved people, this meant a historic turning point. Freedom that previously seemed unattainable now became a reality, at least on paper. But freedom alone did not mean equality. Many of the liberated people faced enormous challenges. They often had no land, no financial security, and only limited access to education. Families who had been separated for years tried to find each other again. At the same time, they had to find their place in a society that was only slowly changing. This phase marked the beginning of a period known as Reconstruction, the reconstruction of the southern states and the integration of the African American population into society. The German government played a central role in this. New laws were enacted to protect the rights of former slaves and allow them to participate in politics. An important step was the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to all people born in the United States. Shortly thereafter, the 15th Amendment followed, granting African American men the right to vote. These measures were revolutionary and represented an attempt to actually implement the ideals of freedom and equality that had been defended during the war. But the way there was anything but easy. In the South, these changes met with strong resistance. Many people who had lost the war were not willing to accept the new order. Tensions arose, which manifested themselves in the form of violence, discrimination, and political resistance. Organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan tried to reverse the progress of Reconstruction. Through intimidation and violence, they wanted to prevent African American people from exercising their new rights. These developments showed that the war had ended slavery, but not automatically the deep-rooted prejudices and inequalities. At the same time, there was also progress. African American men were elected to political office, schools were founded, and new communities were formed. For many, this period was a period of hope in which new opportunities opened up. Education played a decisive role in this, as it was seen as the key to a self-determined life. The country also had to reorient itself economically. The plantation economy of the South was severely weakened, and new systems such as sharecropping emerged. Former slaves cultivated land that did not belong to them and gave part of the harvest to the owners. While this system offered some form of independence, it often led to new dependency and poverty. In the North, industrial development continued. The war had made clear the importance of infrastructure, production, and technology. Factories expanded, railroad networks were expanded, and the United States increasingly developed into a modern industrial nation. Politically, the situation remained tense. The question of how the South should be fully reintegrated into the Union led to conflicts within the government. Different approaches clashed, from a quick reconciliation to stricter measures to enforce the new laws. The death of Abraham Lincoln had made the situation even more difficult. Lincoln had advocated a comparatively mild Reconstruction aimed at reconciliation. After his death, other political forces took over, and Reconstruction developed into a complex and often conflict-ridden process. Chapter 15 shows that the end of the Civil War was not the end of the challenges, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter in which the United States tried to turn into reality the ideals for which it had fought. The American Civil War had raised fundamental questions. What does freedom mean? Who belongs to the nation? And how can a society with such deep contradictions live together? The answers to these questions were not found immediately. They developed over years, decades, and continue to have an impact today. The new America that emerged after the war was not a perfect country. It was marked by progress and setbacks, by hope and conflict. But it was also a country that had changed, a country that became aware of its contradictions and began to deal with them. So this story does not end with a clear conclusion, but with an open look into the future. The Civil War had shaped the nation, but the task of uniting it remained. And perhaps that is precisely the most important insight, that history does not only consist of events, but of the paths that people take afterwards.